webcast. And thanks for attending the session. Let me share my screen. You should see the screen in a minute. Okay, so hopefully you should see the screen now. If not, just send me a message for the questions list. I'll be talking about ADF bindings, and my goal is not to make it as an advanced session, but rather I'll talk about introduction stuff, and probably the audience which I'll target will be from beginners to intermediate and maybe a bit advanced. But my main goal would be to present in detail and in depth to explain the ADF bindings concept and give examples, so you would be able to understand it better and probably would be able to use it with better understanding in your own projects. And I'm actually recording the session, so after the webinar, I'll try to post it on YouTube or something, so it will be available for future reference as well. I have built an application for this webinar, which is based on ADF 12.2.12, and this application is available on GitHub, so you could download this application and run locally. And also all the changes that I'll be doing to this application, at the end I'll commit it to the same GitHub repository, and I'll post it on the blog, this URL afterwards, so you could get all the source code after the webinar as well. And you're free to ask questions. You can send me questions, and I could probably try to answer it live. If not, then I'll try to answer it at the end of the webinar. So we should be around 2 hours, and I'll try to keep some 15 minutes or so at the end for the questions, if there will be any. Okay, so also just to go briefly through the agenda for this webinar today, it's mainly 8 or 7 topics I'll be talking about. First of all, I'll start with ADF bindings overview. Then we'll go to drill down of ADF bindings, and we'll explain how you actually we'll explain the meaning of the bindings and how those bindings are being related to the stuff that you display on the page, and how they're related to the stuff that you fetch from the model there and display. Then we'll go for the different types of bindings. We'll see what kind of bindings are supported in developer wizards, what type of bindings are created when you create LOV tables, ADF query, task flows. We'll talk about some best practices for declarative ADF bindings access, and we'll give some of the examples for programmatic access as well from the Java beans, how we could access one or another method and how we could programmatically execute it. And then we'll leave a bit more advanced example where I will show how you could access bindings across different regions, because this topic usually is very confusing, especially for the newer intermediate ADF developers, and people are always scared to use regions because they're afraid that from one region bindings would not be accessible of this region inside other region. We'll see how this can be done even without contextual events. Okay, so that's a quick introduction into agenda, and probably I'll jump directly into the topic. So first of all, we'll explain a bit the application that I'll be using as a test case. So I thought that I should build this nice Alta UI application, and based on this, I'll explain the topic. So the application is based on 2 tabs: dashboard employees. In the first tab, I have dashboard implementation with tile components, and here some charts and list data. So if I click on tile, then it should get refreshed and should display the data from the second tile. Some delay. Let's see. Maybe I need to start the server, probably. It's slow. Yeah, okay. So that's the second tile, and yeah, let me stop the server and restart it. Okay. We can leave it starting, and while it starts, I can go to the first point of ADF Bindings overview. Actually, how came the idea to run this ADF Bindings webinar to me? A few months ago, I was teaching ADF training in some company and for ADF beginners, and I noticed that from all the topics in ADF, the bindings topic was one of the most complex ones to understand. Well, if you talk, for example, about ADF business components, then it's kind of understandable because it works with the logic from the database to do SQL statements, create, update, delete, LOVs, and so on. Then when you have task flows, you also have the task flow use case. You can do some method calls there, implement navigation flow and business logic. UI is also understandable, but the layer between UI and model, like ADF business components, which is called ADF bindings, is kind of black box. So then let's first take a look into any of the fragments in my application. For example, this could be employee details view, and this fragment implements panel form layout and has some buttons, and so actually also using Masonian layout. So there are different tiles in this fragment. But if I go for the content of this fragment, I will see there are those ADF faces components, and if I take a look into this input text example, then I see that input text contains different properties here, and most of the properties are pointing to some GSF expression. So this is the one GSF expression for the value, then there's another GSF expression for label, for required, for columns, for different properties. And all these expressions, they point to bindings dot something dot input value dot hints, and then there's some other property. And so this bindings is actually a keyword in ADF, and you can think about it as request or session scope. So if you have a managed bin and request scope, so or backend bin scope, so typically you would reference this bin in GSF expression by writing backend bin scope dot bin name dot some property name. Or if you have a session scope bin, then it will be session scope dot bin name dot some property. And you can think about the bindings exactly in the same way, because bindings is some sort of bin as well that's being loaded into memory by ADF, and it scans the context of the bindings that is being loaded for the current frame, and then from that frame it reads all those bindings and creates the mappings on the runtime. So yeah, first of all, the bindings is a keyword that kind of referencing some memory scope in ADF context. So, so then on runtime, once ADF loads this fragment, and once it comes to the this input text, it needs to initialize the input text. And once it's initializing input text, it scans through the properties of this input text component, and from this first property, it finds that there is an expression bindings dot something. Then it understands, okay, bindings, this is the keyword. Then I need to look in the memory scope of bindings and find what is the first name there. And it needs to identify what is the first name. Is it some LOV maybe, or it's some output text, or maybe it's some choice list or whatever. So where it finds it? It finds it in page definition. So if I right click on a fragment and say go to page definition, right, then I see here's the first name is defined as a binding. But let's see how on runtime it works, because now it was simple. I just right click on the fragment, select go to page definition, and I got the first name definition. But on runtime it's slightly different, and you should understand it, how it works. So it kind of will not be a black box. So if I open application sources and open the root package here, then I see data binding CPX file. So usually in every ADF application, ADF faces application, the view controller project always would have this data binding CPX file if you're using bindings. So it's automatically generated by developer. So whenever on runtime you reference bindings, the first thing the runtime would do, it will go and load data binding CPX file, which is like a library of the mappings between all the fragments, pages, and page definitions in your system. Right. So it loads this library or a list, and then it checks the context of the current view. The current view in this case is employees details view. Okay, and it gets this ID and it goes to the bindings, and it's searching for the page mappings. It goes and scans the list of paths that is being defined, and it looks for employees details. Here it is. It finds the entry, and then it goes and checks what is the usage ID which is used for this fragment. It finds the usage ID. And then by this usage ID, it goes to the next section called page definition usages, and again it scans here for this ID. It finds it, and then it locates that actually for this ID is a reference some physical file is defined inside the package, and then inside page devs fragments, and the file name is employee details view page dev. So that's the one. So then if this page definition is not yet loaded in memory, it loads it to the memory. It's doing all the initialization from this page definition file. Once initialization is done, it loads all the components that are defined in this page definition file. And how it loads it, just using Java API, it scans through all these definitions, and it constructs Java objects, because on the runtime, all those bindings are nothing more than Java objects. It's only on design time developer allows in declarative way to define bindings in form of XML. Because if I go to the source of this attribute, first name is defined as XML. But on runtime, it's being converted to the Java object, like control binding or whatever. So it goes and constructs all the objects, and one by one. And then it loads all the bindings. So in this stage, from the bindings, as a memory scope, we were able to go to the data bindings, and we were able to identify, based on the current view context, which page definition is assigned to our fragment. Then all the contents of this page definition were loaded to the memory as Java objects, and then next we come to the attribute first name. So in the next step, after all the objects were constructed and bindings were initialized, it goes to the map and scans for the first name, for the property that is being set for the input text. It scans and it finds, in this case, it's a first in line, first name. It found this binding, and then it checks what is the binding, what is the type of this binding, because there could be different types, and we'll talk about it later in point 3, I think. But it finds first name, and if I go to the source, it's a bit easier to explain. It finds the binding by ID first name, and then it checks the property called iterator binding. So it needs to understand from where this attribute will be initialized, from where it needs to get data. And it finds that iterator binding it points to the employees view1 iterator. Okay, and then it goes to the executable section and it checks for different kind of Java objects that represent DC iterator binding, and it checks all the iterators that were loaded in as objects in memory by ID, and it finds okay, this is the iterator employees v1 iterator, that's fine, and then it checks from where this iterator gets data, because bindings, they can work with ADF BC, or bindings could work based on web services data control, so there could be different underlying implementations, and it needs to understand from where data is coming. So in this case, it finds that iterator binds to the view object employees v1, which is coming from data control, HR model data control. Okay, and it needs to understand now what is this HR model data control, from where it comes. And again, for this, it will check the library of all the mappings in data binding CPX file, and under data control usages here, it would find the same name that is being referenced in page definition file, like HR model data control, right? So it's being found here, and if you look in source, you'll see more details, and it says from which package this data control is coming, and it shows how it's being initialized, how it's being constructed, and so on. And if I'll go to the model project, I'll see there's a package common summary model.services, and here's this application model. So this means that in this case, data control is being constructed from application model, and it finds this, and then it goes and is trying to locate the object instance with name employees v1 inside this application model. So it goes to the application model, loads all the instances, and it finds this employees v1 instance, and it checks if it was executed already or not. If not, it constructs SQL statement, calls to database, gets the raw set data back, and returns and sets the current row. By default is the first one, and from the current row it gets the attribute first name, gets its value, and sends back to the bindings layer. And then the binding layer, since the iterator is already initialized, current row is set by default to the first row. From the current row it gets attribute name first name, and if I double check this view object, for example, view object instance, go to the view object itself, I'll see that this view object contains attribute first name. So that's how it's being initialized. And if you would use some existing name here, then we would get error, obviously. In this case, the name exists, so we are all good. And so as soon as first row is being fetched from the iterator, attribute is being fetched, binding was initialized, and then this Java object is placed in a bindings memory, binding scope, so-called, and then control is returned back to the expression. So in this case, first name attribute object is constructed in memory, and this object is of type control binding, which contains different properties and methods, and one of the methods is get input value. And with this input value or get it input value method, we are able to call back to the Java object which implements this binding, and it gets the value and returns back the value to the field. So the same process, I will not repeat again, but the same exactly process is with all the other properties. For example, for the label, it checks for the current binding container. It goes to data bindings, finds that there is a page definition defined for this fragment. Then it locates again the attribute, and since the attribute is already loaded to the memory, it does less logic now. It just using the same object. Then it calls get hints for this object, and since this attribute was initialized from the view object and it doesn't contain only value. It also contains bunch of other properties that are being provided by attributes from the view object. So if you specify label inside the object, then this is one of the properties that will be available for the get hints, and then from get hints we can go to get label and so on. And this would mean that all the properties that we set on the object or on entity object for the attribute inside the UI hints section here, all those attributes are being transferred to the bindings layer, and this is how we could actually use those properties on UI. So this means that when you look into binding, like our attributes value binding, which represents attributes from the object, you should not think that this returns only actual value. It's much more. So it's the object that represents the attribute. One of the properties is the value, but there are much more properties like label, precision, required, disabled, and so on. So all the stuff like this. Okay, so that was for the attribute binding. Try to explain how it works, and exactly the same thing, for example, with action listeners, like this button previous. In action listener, it points to expression, which also referencing bindings. This means it again finds the page definition file, then it goes to the list of objects that were loaded from this page definition file and looks for the previous, and then it finds that the previous is actually, now it's a different type, it's action, so it's not attribute anymore, it's action, and this means this binding allows to make calls to execute some actions, not just to return the attribute. So it finds this binding, and on top of this binding it could execute it. It calls execute method, and anything that is being referenced from this binding would be executed. So in this case, if I go to the source, I'll see that this binding points to the iterator binding, and it points to the actual view object, and on top of this view object, then it calls action previous. So this means it sets the current row. As the current row, it sets the row from the left, and next it sends as a current row from the right. So it allows to navigate in the row set. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the bindings and explaining how it works from top to the bottom. So the key thing to remember is you see bindings. This means you should refer to the data binding CPX, and then ADF would, for the current fragment, would locate which page definition is being used, and then you should find inside page definition that is related to this fragment, you should find the attribute or action with the same name in page definition, and then depending on the type of this binding, different set of properties can be referenced. Okay, so let's see. Application was started, so after restart, yeah, it's much better. So this is the test case application that I'll be using, and the first tab renders some charts and tiles and dashboard. The second tab with employees data, it should bring some forms. Okay, so this is the first tab here, employees directory, and it gives a list of different entries from HR schema from the employees table. I can click on the employee, and it goes to the editable form for this employee. I could change here, for example, some value, press save, navigate back, and you see that it's being updated now here. Okay, then in the profile section, I'm using masonry layout dashboard, which with custom size for each tile. This is new feature in 12.2.12, where masonry layout is for masonry layout we could provide styles that could give us option to define each tile to be not up to 3 by 3 size, which is by default, but up to 10 to 10. So this one is, I think, 2 to 4, and then is 4 to 2, and there are 2 by 2. And it's nice because you can, on a smaller screen, is being resized and so on. And one of the features here that I implemented, some of those tiles are different regions, but all of them are automatically refreshed. So if I click on next, then we see the charts are being refreshed, even they are coming from different regions. And I'll explain later how this works with bindings. And then one more tab is a simple table with pagination, editable table, and I think the save and cancel buttons are empty for now. Okay, so let's go to employees directory and click edit, and okay, here let's see, there are some attributes, okay, and for employee, and let's see now different types of bindings, how they're being used. For example, what I would try to achieve, first some simple example, I'll add LOV in this personal data field, maybe for job ID, and then we'll see what kind of binding is generated. Because up till now, we saw only attribute bindings and method bindings. Okay, so let me close all those fragments here and open the fragment which renders editable form. And yeah, I should mention that this editable fragment is quite advanced in this case because it contains dynamic implementation, dynamic form. So I think all the bindings here are being constructed dynamically. And yeah, it's just contains entry that points to the iterator, employees view, and then on the fragment it's using a new 12C component called dynamic component, and it iterates over all components that are visible, over all attributes that are visible from that view object, and automatically, depending on the type of this attribute, if it's date, input text, input number, or LV, it automatically renders. So maybe I would not change this fragment, but let's go to to administration, maybe here, and that would be employees table fragment, this one, with the table, and I'll add here above the table some form. Now if I go to the page definition, it contains only table bindings, so let's add a couple of more bindings here. And I can see that okay, also in real projects, when you have a lot of bindings, sometimes it's confusing to understand from which view object the binding is being initialized. So what I'm doing is I'm always going to the binding, selecting the binding, and then each developer draws the dependency and points to the view object instance. And then you can just right click on view object instance here and click edit definition, and then you get view object. This way you save time and you don't need to navigate to application model and search for the view object in the list and try to go to the instance. You can go directly. So let's see, we select the attributes here, and one of the attributes is job ID. Okay, and if I check, there is no LV, so I can see there are no jobs view object to construct LV, but I could simply generate it. So to construct LOV for jobs, I need obviously to have LOV. So this is can be easily done. I could go to new, and there are two options to create new view object. So either I could use new business components from table option or view object option. If I use view object option, then if it's a read-only view object, then I would need to type select statement manually, which is sometimes is okay. If you have select statement, you can copy paste, but not in this case because I would need to type it. So I would use option to generate business components from tables, and simply would select jobs table and render it as generated as read-only view object. Okay, so here's the wizard, and I skip to the third section for read-only view objects. Query here, and I'll get jobs, and then I'll drop it into views LOVs package because it's kind of best practice to separate different view objects, different view object types into different packages. Especially if you get a lot of them, it's much easier to maintain in the future. And I name it as jobs LOV view. Then I don't want to add this view object to the application model because it will be used as LOV, and it's needed in the scope of view object only, in the scope of employees view object. Okay, then here I skip. Okay, it's being created, and there's a bug in new developer version. Sometimes it constructs application model even it was not selected. So then I can just delete application model, which is not needed. Okay, then I can go back to job ID attribute here and add new data source, which should point to the view object that I created, jobs LOV view. And also, what is the difference here in 12c, that by default it points to the view usage from shared application models. So kind of developer is encouraging you to use view objects from the shared application models. You could do this if you know in advance that view object would not be filtered by the different users, and if it would present exactly the same list of data to different users. But not in this case, because my view object, my LOV would have search option, and every user would be able to filter it, and every user may get different result. So I select jobs LOV view, fine, and then I say that I would like to return here job ID, and in this case I would like to use input text with list of values, and maybe I'll select all of the attributes that I'd like to display in LOV list, and let's make it to be automatic. Okay, so LOV was defined. I could go back to the. Okay, sometimes the developer wants to close, but okay, it's familiar error. Let's just ignore it. And now I could go to data control and refresh it, right, and select view object instance, because actually all those bindings that you could, if you want, you could type. So it's all XML, so you don't need to do drag and drop. But obviously, it's much more convenient to do drag and drop and generate all the stuff. But technically, you could write everything by hand if you want, or you could generate. So in some projects, people want to save time, and some common bindings they generate with some utility scripts or some extensions and so on. Okay, so now here I know that job ID comes from the instance employees view 1, and what also is important to understand that all this data control view here is generated out of the application models that are available in the scope of this application. Since right now my application contains only one model project with one application model, so I see only one data control. If I would have ADF shared libraries, attached to my application, then and if those shared libraries would have application modules, then multiple data controls would be listed here. Now it's only one, and okay, let's drag and drop employees view, and probably I'll drag and drop somewhere above the table maybe, and I'll select the option if ADF form, and maybe I'll select here row navigation option. I'll not use submit, and I'll leave only a couple of attributes. So my first name, last name, and job ID. This is my LOV, and the rest I'll remove because I don't need them. And now I can click OK, and at this point all the required bindings are being inserted in the page definition file, and UI components are being automatically created with all the pointers to the attributes that were created in the page definition file. And to make it a bit nicer, maybe I will go and change rows to 1, so all three object components will be displayed in one row. And maybe I'll add some spacer just before panel collection. Okay, like this. And based on the Alta standard, we should not have any buttons below the form. So what is recommended by Oracle Style Guide for the Alta is to have buttons above, somewhere on the top right corner. And this means I could take first button here and drop it above. Maybe just in front of save, and actually I could delete it and I could use only next and previous, so I don't need first and last, because in general, as a best practice for the performance in your ADF applications, you should avoid, if it's possible, using buttons like first and last. Only exception is if you're using range paging in the object, and then last and first buttons are okay to use. Otherwise, with normal VObject, you would force VObject to fetch all the rows from the database when you click last. And if your table contains some thousands of rows, so you may kill performance of the server with such actions. So just for you to know. Okay, so I got previous next, fine, and then if I go to the bindings, I see previously I had only table binding, but now I added first name, last name, and job ID. And if I go to the insert item, actually I could do exactly the same steps manually. So I could create the attributes here manually and then reference it from the UI. Maybe in the next step I'll do this, so you will see how it can be done. But also in this wizard window, what we could do, we could review different types of the bindings. So there are a few of them. So now, and actually in this example, we're using only like 4 types. So we have table, and this is the binding that is suitable to render table and tree. And there's another binding called table and tree table. Those two actually almost never used. Maybe they were used in older ADF versions, but in the modern ADF versions, it doesn't matter if you render tree or you render table. It always developer would always generate for you tree binding, so it's kind of universal binding now. It works with both, with tree and table. So those two can be actually kind of ignored. Navigation list is almost also never used. Even don't know why it's needed here, what it does. And method action is very useful. It's being used when you want to call custom method. We'll also try to call custom method, which is defined in business components. So all the custom methods are called through the method action. Then list of values and lists, they're kind of similar. And I think list of values is used obviously to render bindings for the LOVs. Graph is again, it's kind of not used in the latest ADF versions. It was used in 11G and in early 12C versions for the chart components, but all the modern chart components in the latest versions, they fetch data directly from the tree binding. So they don't use this graph binding anymore. Event binding is when you want to use contextual events and when you subscribe to different events across different regions. So then this is when you use contextual events. With event binding, then button it's almost never used because if you want to call some action, then it's being called from the action binding, like here. And attribute value is for anything that renders the value, like number, value, date number, value, text value. So things like this. So to summarize, the most commonly used bindings and the ones that you should know how to use is action binding to call standard operations. Then there's a method action binding to call custom operations defined by yourself. Then there's attribute value to render, basically to reference, not to render, to reference different values for the attributes. Then event binding is for contextual events, list of values for LOVs. And finally, tree is for collections. So when you render a table or tree, so then you use tree binding. Okay, so now we got this job ID, and if I check in source, as you see, it's using this list of values binding. And job ID is being included now into the fragment here. So if I take a look into the value property, it points bindings.jobid.input value. So from the job ID LOV, it gets input value, and also since LOV is more complex component than input text, it got some extra properties like model, so it knows how to construct the list that will be displayed in the pop-up and so on. So now if I try to redeploy my application, I should see those elements in the form. Well, I'll start actually a few things about GDeveloper tuning. I noticed there's in the preferences of GDeveloper, you could go to the run, and here by default there's such option called enable application rerun optimizations. It's being set, but I usually uncheck it. And the reason for this is I noticed that when it's set, sometimes when you do a run and redeploy your application, the changes that you do are not always picked up, and it's kind of annoying. So because when you run the application, then you don't know if actually your changes are not working or they are not being applied. So I disable this option for rerun optimizations. But then once you disable it, your application model connection that points to database may be closed much slower in 1 minute or so. So to avoid this, I go to the configurations of application model. Okay, there should be configurations. Don't know why it's not displayed. But anyway, I'll go to configurations and let me open again. Not the source. Okay, strange. But in configurations, you could change data source to point to JDBC URL, and then inside application properties, here you could go to deployment, WebLogic, and disable auto generation for JDBC descriptor. And ADF would use direct connection to database, and the deployment would be much faster. Another way is to go to the WebLogic console and define your own data source, and then use the data source for the application model, so that the deployment also will be fast. Okay, so application is running. Let's see if we go to employees here and Last section, administration. Yeah. So I get now those two input texts and this LV, and LV renders this data. Okay. So we used bindings for input text and then for LV. Now let's take a look into two more things: how to render ADF query binding and how to use custom method binding. Because standard action binding can be executed with this next and previous example. So you just click and then it's being executed. And now, what if we have a custom method? How we would call it? So let's create a custom method in application module. So I'll go to application module implementation class and we'll type some custom method here. Test all, for example, and I will print out just this is test all, right? And now, if I would like to call it from the bindings, I would need to go to application model to the Java section and expose this method for the client interface, so it would be available for me in the data control. Yeah, I got a question, and the question is, what deployment procedure do you follow? So to answer it, there are multiple deployment procedures, depends on environment and requirements. So when I develop locally, so I use integrated logic server, and then I just run application like this. And actually, if your application is large and you have in one single application, you may have multiple projects, like vController projects and model projects. So then what I do, I define such thing as working sets. For example, I can create a new working set, and then in the working set I could include only, okay, no, it's only model in the controller here, so it doesn't show any other project. But if I would have more projects, I could select only those projects that I need, and then I can click run and run as a working set, and then it will deploy only this application that this project that I want to run. So if it's development environment, so there is either another option to generate ER file or define and then upload it through the enterprise manager. One more option is to define application server connection in GDeveloper and deploy it directly to the server for the connection. And depending on the project, if project has automation process, then you could have some Jenkins or Hudson server and just commit your code there to the SVN, and the automation process could check out the code, build it, and deploy it. And if you're using developer cloud service from Oracle, it does the same thing. You could use Git and commit your changes to Git, and developer cloud service could build the source and deploy it. Okay, there's another question is, if I have a page template with a string attribute, can I dynamically access it and change the value programmatically? Yes, you can do this, and yeah, maybe I'll show it in example in a few minutes how you could access attribute programmatically, get the value, read it, change the value, set it. I'll show it. And then there's one more question is, what is the best approach to access the object programmatically? So number one is to access from the manage bin. From the manage bin, access the iterator binding, and from there get the view object. Or the second approach, application model function that accessing the view object for the get my view object. So yeah, it depends, but I would think that I personally what I do is I access the binding, and from the binding I get the object, because if I already have the binding is initialized, and then why I would call separately application model? So I just reuse the functionality of the binding. But on the other hand, I would not recommend too often to access view objects in the bins through the bindings or for the application model, because it's strongly recommended all the logic that you do with the view object, you should move it to the business components custom methods, either on view object level or on application model level. And in the bin, you should only consume different UI events like value change listener, action listener, and then collect the parameters and call for the bindings custom methods. And then all the API that related to the business components like view objects and so on, it should be executed on business components level. And there are multiple reasons for this. One of the reasons is that your code would be much easier maintained in the future if you would have the screen separation. So it's more like from architecture point of view. Another reason is more practical, is that going forward there'll be like Oracle Jet, for example, it will be more and more developed, and there'll be Jet reusable components for ADF. And this means that we would need to have more and more REST services available. And if you would have more logic in business components, then it would be much easier for you to reuse this business logic in the future when you would build different UI. So when you would not use ADF faces with JSF, but you would use Jet instead of ADF faces, and you would consume your business logic. So if your business logic in business components, you have less risk in the future when you need to use maybe different UI technology. Okay, and then there's another question is about entity-based view object. Says to refer the entity state I used the raw entity state inside the iterator. Yeah, it's a bit technical question. I think I have a blog somewhere which describes how to read the state of the row if it's new or edit, or it's changed row and so on. So if you drop the question to me by email, I'll try to find a link and I'll send it to you. Okay, so let's back to the application, and yeah, actually there's one more question, says that it's not good to call the application model from the bin. Yeah, application model is not good to reference from the bin, so you should always use bindings, and you should call custom methods, and custom methods should be implemented either on application model or on view object. So you should not construct new instance of the application model in the bin, because this would result in unmanaged state, because then this instance of application model, it would not be maintained properly, and you would consume one more connection to the database, and in case of passivation activation, then this instance would not be correctly activated and so on. So never construct new application model instance in the bin. So in the bin, as I mentioned before, do processing of UI events only, and then all the custom logic should be in business components, and call it through the bindings, either through the custom method bindings or through the standard method bindings. Then there is another question, is to explain how to use LV view object with binding variables. Okay, maybe later I will show it. Another very interesting question is when do you need to implement business logic at view object implementation, and when in application model implementation level? Yeah, that's a very good question. So the typical recommendation is actually why to implement everything just in application model, because you could simply go and say all the custom methods I have, I'll put them in application model. This works for smaller projects, but as soon as you have quite a lot of logic and different custom methods, your application model implementation class is growing so much, and then at some point you even don't know which methods are still relevant and still being used, which methods are not, because it's so hard to maintain. So, and for this reason, it's good to split, and some methods put in application model, some in view object level. And the rule is quite simple. So if your method is using only one view object, data from one view object, or maybe data from the dependent view object, but it's kind of not using like 10 view objects or 5 view objects. So then you put it into this view object implementation method, to the one which this custom method is using. On the other hand, if custom method is working with multiple view objects, fetching data from different view objects, then iterates over those row sets and compares data and calls PLSQL and so on, then this kind of method will go to application model. Yeah. Another example, if your custom method is not using any view objects at all, maybe, but just calls PLSQL with some parameters, then it also will go to the application model. So the rule is simple. If custom method is using specific view object, it goes to the view object implementation. If method is using multiple view objects or just calls some PLSQL, it goes to application model. Okay, then let me go back to the application. So what I was doing, I would like to expose the custom method from application model here. Okay, expose it as a test call. And then if I go back to the data controls, I'll see that the method is available here in data controls list. Okay, then this means it can be invoked. And one more I would like to do is to show also ADF query binding, how to use it. And for this, I would need to define some simple view criteria which I would render on UI. Actually, this one employs view criteria, but is being used for some filtering options, I think. So I'm going to create another criteria. I will name it to be employs view criteria UI name, like this. And I'm going to add here, for example, first name and tail use it starts with, and search option, and then also add last name if starts with. Okay, and in UI hints I'll say that it's automatically executed. Okay, so this is being set, and then I could go to page definition file, and this time I will not drag and drop directly the binding, but I'll add it manually here, and then I'll add also the button on UI manually, and we'll map it with this binding. So let me add binding for test call method. Go to page definition and click add, and I know that custom methods should be always called for the method action. Select method action and expand data control, and I can see method action here. And since this method is coming from the application model, I see it in a root level. If this method will be coming from the view object, then it will be available somewhere from one of the view objects. It doesn't have any parameters, so the section is empty. And click OK, and binding is being created. Okay, then now I would like to call it from some button. Right, so I can drag and drop empty button, and here I could name it the test, and then I could use action listener to call the method action. And let me use method expression builder. In 11G it was not working properly, and we'll see this works better. I could point directly to the method action binding, so I could expand ADF bindings section. And actually, important thing to explain the difference between this bindings and data thing. So why we have those two? So to be simple, bindings under bindings grouping, you always would see the entries that are coming from the page definition that is related to the current fragment. So under bindings, you see everything which is in the context of the page definition for the current fragment or page. And on opposite, under data, you would see the list of all other page definitions that are available in the project. So technically, if some other page definition is being used from another region which is in a shared scope, then technically you could access the binding from that other page definition inside your fragment, and it would return the value. But it's not recommended to do this, because sometimes you may not think about all the cases, and it could be that this another region may be not yet initialized, and bindings are not yet constructed for that another region. And if you would use access the bindings for the data expression from another page definition, then it will return null, and you would get the error. So if you need to use some value from another region, then it's better to copy the value definition inside your own bindings, and maybe I'll show the example later how to do this. So now I select test call here, expand it, and I reference execute operation, and this would allow to execute the method when the button is clicked. Okay, and just also very confusing thing for people who start with ADFs and probably with GSF is the difference why we have these two, action listener and action. So to be simple and short, you should know that first of all that action listener is always invoked first, and action is invoked after the action listener. So that's one rule. Action listener is first, and usually you would use action listener to call some business logic, and also action listener method accepts parameter. This means from the button you can define some ADF attribute or GSF attribute, and you could pass some extra information to the action listener from this button. And this is useful if you have generic action listener in a bin which is being used by multiple buttons, the same method, and then from each button you could pass different attributes. So you could right-click on the button, and you could say that you would like to include GSF attribute, and then here you provide some name and value. And then on another button, which calls the same action listener, you could use another attribute, but the same name, but with different value. And then inside the method, if you would use it in a bin action listener, you could understand from which button the method is invoked. So that's the common usage. Also from this parameter, which is action event, you could get hold to the UI component that invoked this action listener, and then it's quite useful because you could get to the tree of UI components and do some programmatic refresh and different things like that. Action, what's the difference? Main difference with action that it doesn't get any parameter, and but it allows to do navigation. So while action listener accepts parameter, allows to do some logic. Action doesn't accept parameter. It also allows to do some logic if you read data from the bindings, and then also it returns the outcome. So if outcome is defined in task flow, then it would allow to do navigation from one fragment to another, or from one page to another page. Yeah, there's another question for view criteria. If it's possible to add criteria like name equal bind variable or bind variable is null. Yeah, I think it's possible. I don't remember now, but yeah, I think it's possible. Yeah, if not for the wizard, you could always use custom criteria item for the view criteria element and define your own SQL fragment. You can use custom operator and SQL expression here. Okay, so I have a button, and which calls operation, here, and I have few criteria. So let me now on top of the form, I will drag and drop view criteria. Now I would not type it or not use the wizard because it's simpler with view criteria. It's more complex definition, so it's easier to drag and drop. So I go again to the employees view object instance, and here from the name criteria section, I select my UI criteria here, and I just drag and drop it above the form, and I select ADF query panel option, right, and then it gets the criteria is being created. This ADF is UI component, and it also points to the bindings. Now it points to the criteria binding, and we go to the page definition. I see it creates this binding. Yeah, there's another one. It's being used for the table filter because I have a table in the same form, so that's for the table filter. This one is for the UI criteria is being used as a search. There are different properties here. Usually, most of the time, you would not change them. It says that it's being initialized per page flow. That's what we need, and the initial query overridden sometimes could be used. By default, it false, and this means that it's being select statement will be executed when criteria is rendered. If you set it true, this means on initial load, criteria will not be applied. So the results will be rendered without criteria, and only next time when you press search explicitly on the criteria, only then criteria will be applied. Okay, so that's we had method, custom method call, criteria, and now maybe let's see how we can from the binding, from the bin we can access also the bindings and change the value. So there was one question like this, and we could do this even from this test method here. So let's double check what kind of bins I have here, and I have one for countries, dashboards, and employees. And let me double check from which region this employees table view is coming. This one is okay. This employees view. So the faster I go to the page definition probably, and here it is. Okay, so it's included into index page directly in the index page, and it's employees table fragment. So that's the one. Okay, let me close save. There are too many files opened. So employees table renders this employees table view, and I can go to the overview and I can check manage bins. There are no manage bins defined yet for this task also, and accessible for the fragment that is being included into this task also. Let me create one bin, and first of all I just create a class here, and just a Java class, and I'll name it to be, for example, employees table, right, like this. It's created as a Java class. Then I go to the manage bins and section, and I need to reference this Java class. So on runtime, Java class will be initialized by the framework as a bin. And the best practice to use always backend bin scope for the bins that for general purpose bins that are being used by the fragment. Because backend bin scope and request scope, they're kind of the same, and backending scope is coming from ADF, and the difference is that actually both of them survive on the request scope, but the difference is and advantage of backending scope that it's working fine in those scenarios when you have concurrency. So maybe if you have this employee stable flow region, if you include it twice on the same page, then if you would have a bin in a request scope, then if we call the method from region 1, it may call this method from another bin, from another region, and otherwise around. Also, if we have some ADF declarative components which using bins, if those bins would be in request scope, and if we would have those maybe like declarative toolbars, if you would have two toolbars in one fragment, then once you click on a toolbar, it may call bin with this name from another toolbar, and otherwise around. So if you have a backend scope, then it kind of it sticks to the region which initialized this bin, and it always calls method and gets properties from that specific bin and not from other bin with the same name on request scope. So that's the reason why we use backend bin scope here. And probably you would not use bins in page flow scope unless some special cases where you have some parameters map and you want to hold those parameters across different fragments in the same task flow if you don't want to reinitialize them. But most of the time you would rely on data from the data control. And since all the bindings, which I should mention also, it's very important, all the bindings are stateful. This means that if you kind of set current row, then the current row would remain, even you would navigate to another fragment in the same task flow. So as soon as you're in a data control, then it would keep the information about current row, it would keep some temporary data and so on. So data control is stateful. And this is one of the reasons that you don't need actually to store by yourself those temporary values in page flow scope bin. So you would store in page flow scope bin only in some special cases, maybe some user preferences or some temporary values that you calculate and that do not exist in the bindings. Right. So now we have backend bin scope, then a provide name, employee stable bin, and a point to the class, employee stable. In this case, so my bin is defined. Now I could go back to the fragment. Okay, and then for the test button, let's say that I'll change the action listener. So I'll call the listener in the bin. So I'll go here and click edit. Then since the bin is defined for my task flow, where the fragment is included, bin is visible. And then I can click new and test call method, for example. Test call listener. Okay, it's being created. And now if I go to bindings, I see that the binding for my method was removed. This was done by gdeveloper because it saw that gdeveloper saw that we're actually changing the action listener, and this method is not being used by any other method, and it thought that we don't need it anymore. It dropped it automatically. And this sometimes is annoying, and especially if you want to use this method in next step in Java, so then we need to add it again. One of the approaches sometimes when I'm changing complex bindings and I don't want to lose them if I do some change, so instead of deleting from the wizard, I just comment out the part of the source and then delete it, so that then gdeveloper doesn't know that I actually deleted the source and it keeps the bindings. So now I need to go back here and add the binding again. Test call. Okay, so it's there. Okay, now I can go to the bin and I see that as soon as I created action listener for this test button, it generated the method inside employees table. And as I was mentioning before, there's this action event thing, right? That default parameter that is being passed to the action listener, and which contains a reference to the UI component which initialized the call. And we could get a lot of useful info from that, like attributes and type of the component, and we could reference UI component tree. Now let's do a couple of things here. First, let's call the same custom method from the bin programmatically here. And usually you would use, you could actually access bindings with API directly. You could access binding context and get a binding container from there and get all the binding entries. But to save lines of code, I always use utility classes called ADF utils and GSF utils. Those two can be downloaded from the standard Oracle examples, like I think Work Better contains these classes, and also some older examples as well, and you could copy it to your project. And this is what those classes were implemented a while ago by Oracle product managers, and they are just distributed for the sample applications. So GSF utils contains helper methods for everything that you need to access GSF. So if you want to call manage bin, so you could say use method get manage bin value and provide bin name dot property, then it automatically will wrap your text with expression and execute it, and you will get the value. So there are a lot of helpful methods here, and you could download them from Oracle Technology Network. ADF example. Then ADF utils it helps to work with bindings. So if GSF utils is everything around GSF, ADF utils it's everything around bindings. And for example, if I want to call custom method, which is located in page definition, this test call. So first of all, programmatically I need to get access to the binding container, and I have this ADF utils static class, and here I can just use directly method find operation, so I don't need to get hold of bindings and so on. It all happens in the method. Because if I could here provide the method name test call, and this is operation binding. Right, and import it, and then to call the method I just do execute, and this would essentially do the same execute as you were doing directly from the button in GSF, so it would call the method. Right, and if I take a look into this find operation, then I see that what it does, it gets to the hold to the binding container, then it calls operation binding, and then from there it just returns the instance of operation binding, and we can do whatever we want. We can, if our method would have some parameters to pass, we could say get params map, and then put and by name and by value. We could specify, and then it would pass the values to all the parameters that we need. Then we execute, and what is a useful feature of operation binding is, for example, if you would like to check if the method was successfully executed, we could do get errors and, for example, size. So if it's greater than 0, then this means there was an error or exception in the method, and based on this we could decide to do some next step or not to do. So we always can check if error method was executed successfully or not. Now, if I would like to change, for example, first name, I can do it also programmatically. So I could copy paste the ID of this first name attribute, and also with help of ADF utils, I could get hold of this attribute, and with a method called getBound attribute value, and then I just point it directly to the attribute ID, and Then I could double check that this method returns object and it returns the value. So it returns just directly the same thing as you would have in the fragment which is being referenced by input value. So I go here, so the same input value, like get input value method, which it returns, the same thing is returned by get bound attribute value. And node string and sample first name. I just cast it and say print it out here, and then I could also change the values. So for the same first name, I could say set bound attribute value. Then again, I write first name, and then maybe I'll use something like first name plus ABC, for example, and this would change the value, right? And we should see this change instantly on UI, because if I take a look, the pattern test is set by default with partial submit true, and then if I double check the bindings, I check first name, I check iterator, it will see in the latest release every iterator which is created is assigned automatically with change event policy PPR, and this means that if any change happens for the value of the binding, even it's programmatic change like this, then it should synchronize the binding object, and it updates the UI for the Ajax partial response. It sends the value to the UI, and the value is displayed instantly if this option is set. So you can see how it works. Let me can redeploy it. While stars, I see there's a question. We always prefer page flow scope, as in many use cases we need to transfer values in the same task flow. So is that the correct approach? Yeah, well, technically it works, but you may have face the issues if you deploy your application on this high availability environment, because on the high availability environment, when you have cluster and you have different those WebLogic managed servers, so if one of the managed server fails, if high availability is enabled, then it would transfer the session from this failed node to operational node, and user would not user session would not break it. User would still be able to work, because WebLogic knows how to basically reinitialize the bins in request scope or in the backend bin scope. But if you have a bin in page flow scope or session scope, then the bin state is lost, and you will not be able to it will not be able to recreate it. And while ADF actually supports this option to enable support for higher availability for page flow scope bins, but still, if from my experience, it doesn't just always work, especially if there are a lot of bins and still bin may not be serializable, and the state would not be transferred. And from memory consumption also, because if you have all the bins in page flow scope, this means the memory is occupied always. So as long as you are in the current task flow, as long as page flow scope of the current task flow is active, so it doesn't matter if value is used or not, it's always in memory. While if you use request scope or backend bin scope, then the memory is occupied only for the duration of the request, and then it's being released. And all the temporary data stays on data control, right? And then this memory can be used by other sessions. So essentially, probably you would be able to support more concurrent sessions if you would use less page flow scope bins. But also it depends on each system. So it depends on implementation and on complexity of the bins and so on. So probably to say simply that if you use less page flow scope bins, you could support more HTTP sessions, then probably it would not be correct, because it all depends on implementation. But in theory at least, it's recommended to have more backend bin scope and less partial scope bins, simply because you could have all the stateful data in data controller. Okay, hope this answers the question. Let's see now in application. Okay, let's go to administration tab. Okay, so now I have this query which is rendered from the query binding. Then I have my components here, and now let's if I go back to the developer and clear the log, then go back here, test. Okay, I see that first name was changed, and it was changed even in the table because the same binding was used in the form, and essentially to the same attributed points in the table. And then if I go to the log, then I see that it was the custom method from the application was invoked, that it's printed text, and then original value from the binding was also retrieved and printed. So that's good. And let me show this change event policy thing. Now if I go to the iterator and now I remove it to set to none. Why, you may ask why we would need to set to none if this PPR option will get refreshed by default. Right? So sometimes you still need to set to none, especially in complex forms. So you need to be careful using this change event policy for performance reasons, because when it's set to PPR by default, this means on each request, server sends a bigger response, because for all the fields that are coming from the iterator with change event policy PPR, in the response it includes some extra information. So the response size that is sent from the server to the client is bigger. And in the complex forms, it could be bigger, maybe 2 times than normal response. And if your application is accessed on a slow network, on a remote network, then you would notice the difference of this larger response size, because it would take some more milliseconds to receive response, and it's essentially on the complex forms it could delay by 1 second, for example, the response time. And this is why I say that it should be carefully used, and probably most of the time you could use none, and you should use PPR when you have some dynamic forms or you have some cases where you don't know in advance when refresh should happen. Like maybe data can be changed from one button, from another button programmatically. So if there are many cases like this, then it's kind of complex to set all those partial trigger dependencies. So in these cases, you could just say change event policy PPR, and it automatically will be synchronized. But if you could identify all those dependencies during development time for the refresh, I would recommend to set change event policy to none, simply because the response size of the request would be smaller, and it will be faster because of that. Then the transfer time of the network will be faster. So now if I set to none, what I need to do to make it work, I need to set partial trigger now, because if I refresh the application, this change was done in the binding, so let me reload it. Now when I click test button, then I should not see the update in the first name field. Now, and then I say, when I set partial trigger, I should see it. So now I go back to the table. Okay, administration. Okay, now I click test. See, now this value is not being updated. Now if we go back to developer, I'll go to the fragment here, and for the form, panel form layout, or I could set it for component itself, or for the form itself, I set partial trigger dependency manually. I said that this form should be refreshed when from the toolbar when pattern, I'm not sure what before. Let's double check for the test 4. It's before, okay, so I guess. So when before button is pressed, then partial trigger is defined to refresh the panel formula. So when I save it and go back to the UI, now I press test, now it's refreshed because of the partial trigger is defined. So that's the difference with change event policy. By default, you would have refresh for everything, but probably you would have a slightly worse performance. If you have better performance, then you need to go to the change event policy none and define this the partial trigger dependency manually. Because otherwise, when you have change event policy PPR, even you would have pressed other buttons like save, cancel, next, which it still would include in the response size all the information about all the fields and this broader response size. I think I have a blog about it as well. It was in April this year was posted about that thing, so I could look it up for more detailed information. Okay, then one more important thing I would like to show is about ADF binding sharing and access from ADF task groups. And for that reason, for this case, I would go to another fragment. This is employees details view. The one which is this is the go to the application. This is the fragment that renders profile tab. So all those tiles in a dashboard. So this is one tile, then another one, and those two are, if I go to the fragment, they are rendered from the regions. Here. Right, so let me go to, for example, salary average region, this one, and go to, it's probably in the tiles, yeah, this is the salary average. And let me open the fragment. Okay, and I could also check page definitions. So there's a max salary, mean salary, and salary are being used, and some status meters rendering the visual representation. So now I will show you. It's a very common question for ADF developers. Like if I'm in this region here, how I could access data from another region or fragment. So what I would do, I would put the button here and I would display the current first name. So for example, if I now first name is Lex, then how I can access the value of this first name inside this region. Because I could see that employee details contains the region, right? And the first name is here inside employee detail view, but our region is implemented with another task flow, which contains another fragment, and there is no first name here. Right. And now, a very important thing about behavior of the task flows. So if I go to any task flow overview, I could go to the behavior section, and under transaction group, I see this option with share data controls with calling task flow. And by default, it's always set to share. There are other options here. I would not go in detail because you can check this in developer guide, but what is the essential thing is to understand is that share data controls with calling task flow by default shared. You can set it to isolated. So when it's shared and when you include your task flow in another fragment, this means you could access the bindings of another fragment inside your fragment. So you should think about it as one large memory scope which is being accessed and shared across all those task flows that are shared. If I would change my task flow to isolated mode, this means this task flow would run in isolated mode, and it would contain its own memory scope, and I would not be able from my task to see the values of the bindings that are outside. And when you run task in isolated mode, when you do commit, rollback, then all these transactional operations are applied to the bindings of this current task flow. They don't affect bindings of other task flows. This happens simply because when you run in isolated mode, then programmatically ADF creates another instance of application model on runtime. And even you don't create it manually, as soon as you select isolated mode, ADF on runtime for you, it will create another instance, and technically it will be like completely two different business component sessions. And sometimes it's useful when you have like UI shell application, and in every tab you would like to render independent form, and when you save or rollback in that form, you don't want to affect data in another tab. That's fine, but the danger of that could be if you would use a lot of task flows, and in all of them, and even in the smaller task flows, you would set isolated scope, then you would create a lot of application model instances on runtime. And even one physical user could create them like 20, 30, 50 application model instances, and then this would result in a large number of database connections, because every application model instance would use its own database connection, and you would have a heavy load on database. And that's a common mistake and common issue with performance, because people wondering why ADF, for example, not able to run like 100 or 200 concurrent users in the system. But then when we do review, we can see that there are a lot of isolated task flows, each of them creating a separate application model instance, and then this results on a heavy load on database, and then database is just not able to process all those requests. So that's the common source of the performance problems when you have a lot of isolated tasks. But now let's come back to the use case. So inside this region here, I would like to access first name. And since it's shared, so what I could do, I could go to the bindings of this file and access the binding here. So I could create attribute value, point to the iterator, and here I could specify first name, right, and create it here, right. And since the iterator is set to change event policy PPR, I could go back to here, and maybe instead of let's see, next to the salary average, I would put a reference to my binding, and I'll use expression builder, and I would reference from the current binding context. I would reference first name, and among all the attributes I would want to get the value, so I'll point to a property called input value. Okay, that's done. And I refresh it. And we'll see how it works now, and then I'll change to isolated mode, and then with isolated mode you will see that the value will not be synchronized anymore. So to give you some feeling of the difference between shared and isolated mode. So now I go to dashboard. Okay, now it's given, and now click next, and you see it's being automatically refreshed, even it's a different region. Okay, now if I go back to taskbar and change here from shared to isolated, and do refresh, go to employees and profile. Now click next. You see first name is changing here, but status meter is not changing anymore, and first name is not changing because this region now it runs in its own separate transaction with its own application model instance, and it doesn't know anything about changes that happen in employees view object inside this fragment, because this one it has its own application model instance and its own view object instance, and it's using its own select statement, and it's using its own row set and current row state and so on. Okay, and yeah, I have 5 minutes more before questions, so let me. One more thing I wanted to show is how to use bindings on a task level. So if I go to the employees table flow that we worked before, actually, for example, I could go to the I could create another custom method on employees view object quickly here, and yeah, actually it's this one already filtered by country, so let me see, maybe I could use this method. Yeah, so it's passing the ID and of the country and sets bind variable here for the view criteria and executes. So probably I could use this method. Okay, so there are 2 ways how to use this on a task level bindings, either directly or through the Java bin also. So let's first use the direct approach. I could go to the data controls again and could select employees view. Then I could, since this method is coming from the view object, it's now under view object level, not under root application model. You can drag and drop it. And here I could, doesn't allow me to enter it, so I could enter it a bit later. So I point to the method, click OK, method is inserted, and I specify this method to be default activity, so it's invoked before the fragment, and then I create navigation rule from the method to the fragment. And I should not forget to set the value, which I could use again expression language, and that would use constant value US, for example. Click OK, and better to double check if it was really saved, and I see that page definition was automatically generated for that method. And if I go to page definition, then see the method here, and I can double check the value was set. So this method got its own page definition. This is what happens. JDeveloper automatically generates this kind of page definitions for the methods on task level. You could manually go to the data bindings file and remap. For example, you could go and say that you don't want to use separate page definition file for this method, but you input ID of the page itself, of employees page, and then you could use bindings of the page itself in the method. But by default, it creates another file with its own bindings. Okay, then I go here to administration. Yeah, it should be some issue with application model, but okay. Yeah, okay, maybe some issue there, so I'm not sure, but in practice it should work, because I just drag and drop, but I will not spend time troubleshooting. Okay, and another approach would be instead of pointing to the bindings, you could point to the method expression to the bin, and from the bin, from backend bin, the scope bin, for example, you could, in the same way like we did here in the employees table, from that method you could access the bindings and call the bindings. You would prepare your parameters here and do different stuff. Calculate it. Okay, so I have some 15 minutes more, so let me go through the questions now. It's quite a lot of questions. The question is, what is the best practice to reduce the opening connections? So I guess this is for application model connections. So the best practice is simple. You should go to configuration of the application model, and in the properties of application model, I would recommend to set it's here under database and scalability. I would recommend to set disconnect application model upon release option. This would force application model to return database connection back to the pool, and this would not hold connection, and another session would use it. And it's by our test, performance improves around 30% because application model BC layer doesn't cache all those statements, SQL statements, since the statements are already cached in data source and WebLogic, so we don't need to duplicate them. And on the other hand, the number of open database connections drops significantly, and much more connections are being used. And when you set this option, don't forget to go to properties and add another option called GBO-TXN disconnect level, and it should be set to 1. This will make sure that once connection will be removed back to the pool, application model would not lose any temporary data, so it would hold it in memory. So it's disconnect level 1. And I have a blog about it, so you can check online. There's a question about change event policy. Someone says that from my experience in all the versions of ADF, this option often leads to errors like component with ID is not registered for active data. So I will set change event policy to none. Has anything changed these days? No, the same bug still exists in the latest ADF version, and it exists specifically when you have export to Excel functionality. And in the latest version, it even doesn't help to change it to none. It still is being reproduced. So usually what we do is we implement our own functionality for export to Excel, and we don't use this standard listener. Another question is, when calling taskflow as a taskflow call activity and variables need to be shared between the calling and the call taskflow, doesn't the page scope bin make more sense? Yeah, the thing is that page scope bin would not be available in another task flow, because another task flow would have its own page scope bin. So what you could do, you could pass parameters for the task flow parameters, and you could define them in page scope, right? And then you could use them. Of course, yeah, the only thing that which actually makes sense is maybe if you have a lot of parameters in the task flow, so yes, then it makes sense to create a Java class, define it in page scope in this task flow, and assign all those input parameters to the bin. So in this way, it's much easier to control the number of parameters that is being used by the task flow. So in this case, it makes sense to use page scope bin, but it doesn't make sense to use page scope bin to hold action listeners, actions, value change listeners, and so on. To use page scope bin for to hold parameters, it's a good idea. Okay, let's see. Other question. There's a question where table with a million records and is an empty object, the object can try to create a row, but it's not, it takes so much time. Yeah, it probably depends if you're using ordering in the object, and maybe when you create a new row, you're trying to insert it at the end of the row set. And then ADF, what it will do, it will fetch all the rows up to this new row, and it will fetch all the rows from the database. So you should be careful with the position where this new row is being inserted. What could help if you actually need to insert it in a last position, so you should use range paging for the view object, and then it would navigate to the last range much faster because it would just execute, at least in the latest 12C version, this works. It would execute with only a range of rows from the last row set, and it would not fetch all the rows up to last row. So you could explore the range paging for this. Okay, there's another question about change event policy, about the situation when input text prints something and your component refreshes each time, and while you have auto-suggest items in this input text, you have a problem to use PPR change event policy for auto-suggest items. Yeah, this is what I was mentioning, that we should be careful with change event policy and should not use it just always. And I personally use change event policy PPR when it's actually needed, when I have dynamic UI, when I'm not able to set partial trigger, or when I have a lot of different UI dependencies, and then it's just very complex to set this partial trigger dependencies. So then change event policy is useful. In other cases, I try to avoid using it because it slows down performance and adds extra processing time. Then another question is, if we use commit operation in one shared task flow, the other one also will be affected. Yes. So if two task flows are running in shared scope, this means they're using the same application model instance. Yeah, obviously, if maybe your two task flows are using two different application model instances, and commit is done per application model, then it would not be affected. But if you're using the same application model for both task flows, and if they're in shared scope, if you commit pending data in one and have pending data in another one, then it will be committed as well. Okay, another question is shared data control best practice, and are there any practices? So, yeah, it depends on the use cases. So I said that if you have a requirement where you want to load some from the menu structure, you load the form, and one form, then you load another form. And if you have a requirement to keep different transactions, so if you do save in one form, you don't want to do save in another form, then you have those root task forces isolated, and everything inside is shared with another regions. Yeah, so typically, by default, all the task forces will be shared, and then I would use isolated task force only when I need to make sure that transactions will not be affected across different task forces, like on the root level. Okay, another question is, what is AM pooling? Okay, so AM pooling is, how to say, explained in a more simple way, because ADF is a web framework, and for those of you who work with Oracle Forms, so you should be familiar that in Forms you always maintain one connection to a database. You log in and you always get this connection and it stays assigned to you. Well, in ADF it's different because it runs on the web, and in advance you would not know how many users may log in, how many sessions there would be on the web. So to handle larger number of concurrent users, ADF application model runs in a pool. So this means there could be multiple application model instances created to serve a certain number of users, and if there will be more sessions appearing or coming, more users coming to the system, it may still reuse the same number of application model instances. So for the user who is not active right now, it will take away his application model instance and to give it to another user who wants to do some request right now. And for this application model instance, another user would fetch data, would execute the objects, would do transactions and so on. And afterwards, this instance could be returned to the first user. So it's just to save resources on the server. ADF contains a pool of active instances that can be shared across users. Yeah, the entity cache is, what is the entity cache is another question. So once you change the data, it's being submitted to the server, but it's not going to database directly. And until you do commit or rollback, it stays on the server side in business components. And because entity object is responsible to hold all the changes of your data and is responsible to submit changes to database. So in entity cache, you just simply keep the data that is changed but not yet submitted to database. Another question, if you want to use select on choice, which is the best way to do it in the binding level? Yeah, first of all, I would say that I would use select on choice only if I have a small list of data that I want to display in this select on choice. Because there's one bad thing with select on choice. It's being the SQL query is being executed for select on choice on a fragment load. So if you have 10 or 20 select on choices in one fragment, this means in the moment when fragment is loaded, then 20 SQL statements would be executed for all select on choices. Instead of select on choice, I would recommend to use combo box LV, which also have a drop-down, but the data from this drop-down is executed later when actually user clicks on this drop-down. Only then query is executed and then list is constructed. And to use it, it's quite simple. You just, if you, in the place where I had LOV for job ID, I had the pop-up. So in UI hints of this LOV, instead of using input text with list of values, I could say combo box or combo box with list of values, which allows to open the pop-up also. So you might have some 10 records display in drop-down. To see more records, you click search more, it shows the pop-up. And simple choice list is rendered with choice list option. And then when you drag and drop this attribute on the form, it automatically checks what kind of LOV, what kind of list is set here, and then it renders choice list for you automatically. So you don't need to create any binding manually. The same like it created LOV binding for me automatically. Another question, is it possible to access binding from another fragment inside the same task tool? Yes, so it's possible, and it's done exactly the same way as I did in this dashboard UI, where I, inside another region, I was able to just went to the binding, like salary average flow here, and in page definition, I just went and included attribute from which is initialized in another page definition. So if you have two shared task flows, you can do this. If you have isolated task flow, then you could not access directly, but you could still use contextual events and then send from one region to another this data for the contextual event. Yeah, I get, yes, there's actually, why it didn't work for me, because there's a bug. In new developer, it doesn't create correctly method in page definition, this method binding, so I need to go and modify it. Yeah, so I got advice from one guy here to, yeah, that's correct. Kind of forgot it, so thanks. And I think have a blog about it as well, and I forgot myself. So it happens. Another question is, could you explain the 10 properties related to pooling? Yeah, I could go and quickly explain this. We have 1 minute or so. So that probably would be the last question that we will go through. And the pooling here. So initial pool size, all the properties you get in C4J, XC4G file are important for the pooling. And So initial pool size 0 is kind of says that by default one application is deployed, and initially it would have so many application model instances in the pool. You could set 100 or 0 depending on initial number of users, but in practice it really doesn't matter. You could keep it 0 and still it would be fine. It doesn't make sense much for performance if it's 0. Maximum pool size is the total number of instances that application model could have. By default is 4096. It's more than enough, and usually this number is not changed, because usually if you have a large system handling many users, then you would have a cluster, and then on each cluster you would support, let's say, up to 1000 concurrent users and so on. So this maximum pool size is not important property. Reference pool size is important. By default it's 10, and this is the number of application model instances that under normal load would be allowed to be created. So if there would be more than 10 concurrent users, then passivation activation would happen, and it would start switching application model instance from one user to another, and the system would slow down. So general recommendation is to avoid passivation activation and increase reference pool size to the larger number to support expected number of concurrent users. So if you estimate that maybe there'll be 300 concurrent users working on the same time, then you would set it to like 400 or so to increase this number to make sure that you avoid passivation activation. Minimum available size is when there is no activity, how many application model instances would stay in memory. So it's by default 5, but usually we change to 0, just to remove all the resources. Maximum available size is the number of instances that application model pool would grow under stress load. So if the application performs slowly, then it could increase from 10 to 25 in this case. So it's usually by 25% more than reference pool size. Then idle instance timeout by default 10 minutes, and you should set it to be at least longer than web session timeout, because if it's shorter than web session timeout, what could happen? It could happen passivation. So web session could stay active, user could go for a break, come back after 10 minutes, and then his session is activated, and this activation is a bit slow. So it's usually we will set it to be longer than web session timeout. And pooling interval, it's the interval which is kind of in this interval every time application model processor checks if there are any inactive instances, and then it closing them. So by default 10 minutes. But if you increase the idle instance timeout, then it makes sense to increase pooling interval and not check for those idle instances so often. So that's in brief the properties for application model pool. And yeah, we're actually out of time. So probably I would not have time to answer all other questions, like quite a lot of them. And yeah, thanks for attending, and hopefully you learned something new. My goal was to go through the basics and to touch some intermediate and slightly advanced things. And I will upload the changes that I made here to the GitHub repository, and I'll post the blog afterwards, so you'd have the URL to this GitHub repository. Also, I'll try to post the recording for this webinar, and you could watch it afterwards. Okay, so thank you, and goodbye. Hopefully, you'll have time in a few months or so to run another webinar, and we'll talk about some other topics. Have in mind to talk about ADF BC REST more and JetUI frontend. So that's hopefully will be the next topic in end of January or February. Okay, so thank you guys, and goodbye.